Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for everyone joining us online as well. My name is John Tousell, the Senior Director for Agriculture Methane here at the Environmental Defense Fund, and appreciate the opportunity to talk today about livestock and methane, and particularly why livestock productivity is key to boosting livelihoods while solving for agricultural methane. I might just I'll introduce our panel here to start with. I really appreciate everyone being here. So to my left is Hayden Montgomery, who is the Agricultural Program Director for the Global Methane Hub. I'll read a bio on each of these folks so you're aware of it. Global Methane Hub supports and sustains action from civil society, government, and private industry by meaningfully investing in methane reduction solutions. Hayden was most recently the special representative of the Global Research Alliance for Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, coordinating research between countries and partner organizations. He also has served as New Zealand's ambassador to Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, and is a negotiator for New Zealand in the UN negotiations on climate change. Next to Hayden is Professor Mario Ferraro. He is faculty in the Department of Global Development in Cornell University's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. His research focuses on sustainability of food systems for the benefit of humans and ecosystems. He works in the areas of sustainable intensification of agriculture, climate mitigation and adaptation, livestock systems, and healthy and sustainable diets. He holds a PhD in agricultural sciences from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And the final panelist also joining us is Claudia Arndt, senior scientist and team leader at the Mazengira Center for the International Livestock Research Institute. Her prior work in livestock systems include roles in Peru and Costa Rica, and early on she was part of the team at EDF. So welcome home, welcome back. So, she holds a PhD in dairy science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm really excited about the panel to talk to us with today. I might just set the stage about why we're here and why we're talking about agricultural methane. So here at EDF, we believe in building a vital earth for everyone. And in our minds, climate change threatens a vital earth for all of life. And so when you look at, and particularly from a methane perspective, methane today, 25% of global warming that we're experiencing today is caused by methane. It's a highly potent greenhouse gas. And the challenge and why we're talking about agricultural methane is that the largest source of human caused methane in the environment is enteric emissions. The largest single source is enteric emissions from livestock. So that's kind of the challenge we have as to how do we solve this livestock emission challenge. At the same time, when we talk about a vital earth, I also think about the vital nutrition and the vital livelihoods that livestock provide to the global community. And so when we think about the value of the nutrition of dairy as kind of one of the most complete sources of some of the major required amino acids, and we think about calcium requirements and nutrient requirements that dairy and meat provide, we need that comprehensive protein, particularly in lower income economies, to provide nutrition to the population. We also think about the vital livelihoods that livestock provide for around the world. So it's estimated that over 1 billion people globally receive some portion of their livelihood from the dairy sector. So all of that combined creates this challenge of how do we solve methane in livestock systems while also allowing them to continue to provide nutrition and livelihoods around the world. So I think the data really kind of lay out two pathways, right? We've got mitigation. So in countries that have high production dairy systems or livestock systems, we talk about how do we reduce methane through technologies like feed additives, which adjust the digestive system of the cow to reduce methane. But there's another question about when we talk about methane intensity in productivity units. And so as an example, in the US, some of our dairy systems are an order of magnitude more efficient from a methane perspective than some other countries in the global South. Conversation today is how can we drive productivity and efficiency within our livestock systems in a way that also provides ongoing livelihoods and nutrition benefits. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to kind of take 5 to 10 minutes, whatever they feel comfortable with, kind of talking a little bit about what that means to them and some of the work that they've done. And but before that, I might say we probably should define productivity a little bit. Is that Is that so? Somebody said, I said to productivity to somebody the other day, and they said, "Oh, do you mean that we're going to get more just more cows?" And I think so that's one definition. I think what we're using the word productivity around is how do we become more efficient with every cow? So how do we improve the amount of milk each cow makes, or how do we improve the rate of gain for every cow from a beef perspective or a livestock perspective? Is that collectively kind of where we're talking? Oh, Claudia, all right, go, yeah.
So, yeah, not just looking at increasing. If you make the same amount of milk with using less resources, that's also productivity increase.
That's a great point.
So we shouldn't just be aiming for increasing yield, because sometimes farmers want to go for like the most milk the cow can give, but it's maybe not profitable really. So
that's great. So it's better use of our resources. Could be another way to do it. Yeah. That's a great point. Great. Well, thanks. So everybody clear on that? Anybody questions on that definition? That's the one we'll be working with today. Great. Mario, I wonder if you might go first, because you kind of a paper that you're a co-author on kind of inspired this panel for me, and maybe talk a little bit about productivity in terms of methane and just how that hits you a little bit, your work.
Okay, sure. Well, as a way of introduction, what I want to say is that we have a food system in disarray. We have obesity occurring simultaneously as we have undernutrition or micronutrient deficiencies in many parts of the world. We are exceeding a range of planetary boundaries, of which the climate one is only one of them, and livestock are at the center of many of these debates on how to transition towards a more sustainable food system, a more sustainable world. Livestock are super important. Livestock help revisit some of the issues that we have with equity in low and middle income countries. They are extremely important as a source of livelihoods and income. And traditionally, the livestock sector, it's been in many parts vilified. In others, some with reason, in others with less reason. And we as scientists need to actually help provide clarity on the issues that we have. We have some of the key facts. We have an increase in demand caused by rising incomes and population growth. What we observe in the case of ruminants is that demand per capita is increasing, and is increasing in the majority of the places. Demand per capita of beef has actually stagnated in the majority of places, bar China and Brazil, where you still see increases in per capita. So for beef, the situation is different in the sense that what we're seeing there is the population growth effect. But per capita, things have sort of stabilized. Now, what has happened since the 60s? Since the 60s, the ruminant, both the ruminant and the monogastric sector have actually increased productivity very, very significantly, and have also reduced emissions per unit of product really significantly. In a paper that we did with Kyle Davids, we demonstrated that we now produce, say, 1,000 kilocalories from livestock with 64% less emissions intensity that we did in 1961. How has this happened? Well, this is partly driven by structural change. As countries get richer, we actually start transitioning from very subsistence kind of agriculture and livestock to more industrialized, less dependent from the land and so on. And you can see now places like many of the OECD countries that have even had super significant increases in productivity, 5 times, and they have managed to actually reduce animal numbers as part of the process. So in many cases, they've even produced more milk with less animals than what it was in the past. Of course, these are populations that have already reached adequate consumption levels of many of these products. In low and middle income countries, it's a little bit different. You have a mix and match of countries where you have some countries that have made really great progress at increasing productivity. Yields of animals. Some, in cases, maintaining the dairy herd or the beef herd equally, but in other cases, intensification has gone at the same time as expansion, or in many other cases, yields have stagnated, and what you see is vast increases in animal numbers. Why does this matter for methane, for greenhouse gases in general? Methane is one, but ultimately what we want is to reduce the land footprint of the livestock sector as much as we can, because it has a very wide range of ancillary benefits as well. Water cycles, biodiversity, and a range of other things. So we have predicated increasing yields and perhaps or maintaining yields, but being more resource use efficient as a way of achieving this. At the end of the day, producing more with less animals is what we desire. If you've ever seen methane emission intensity curves, you will see that at very low productivity levels, the amounts of methane produced per kilo of protein are very high. Why is this? Well, because, this is actually, we are basically, there's a huge fixed cost, which is the maintenance requirement of the animal, that actually is basically swallowing all that emissions intensity. So when we start really increasing productivity in those areas around the 500, say, liters of milk per day, say going from a kilo to a kilo and a half to 2 kilos, all of a sudden those tremendous increasing, doubling in production reduces the emissions intensity enormously. What tends to happen, obviously, is that in many cases these practices are very profitable. So the response that many farmers have, typically, for example, in Latin America, what has happened is that there's been a lot of what we call rebound, which is that rather than having less animals and producing the same amount, well, it's so profitable that you end up doing more of the same. And in the process, we chop the Amazon. That's what happened. And we planted improved pastures that could actually increase stocking rates very significantly. And we just put more animals. It's obvious, if you have export economies, like many of those in neotropical countries, it made absolute sense if you look at the economics, especially without any incentive or without any policy to actually reduce or control the emissions, without carbon prices. This was sort of obvious that it was going to happen. Now, in the smallholder setting in sub-Saharan Africa, it's a little bit different because, there's less land per capita as well. So, you end up having a more confined, sorry, I'm playing with this. I shouldn't be playing with that. In sub-Saharan Africa, where resource scarcity is so high, these increases in efficiency mean all sorts of additional things. It's not only land, but it's labor. It's being able to also put land to plant vegetables, compromises between food crops, feed crops, etc., that really start becoming very important when you look at livestock as part of a livelihood system. So in reality, what we want is to make the most of those very, very precious resources, even producing less, but, releasing the pressure on other parts of the system. I focus on not only on methane, but also on the land part, because at the end of the day, it's this land sparing effect of having less animals that we want to try to achieve one way or another in the different geographies. And in many of the studies that you see, this has become a very important part of the equation for achieving the mitigation targets that we often compute in the IPCC or in the other reports that you see around. I want to say that, the progress in increasing yields has been formidable, but has been patchy. I want you to remember that, and we need now to ensure that we apply this arsenal of things that my colleagues here are going to talk about to really increase productivity. I think that the set of incentives that we have nowadays are really completely different than what we had 10 years ago when we were really trying to do this. And with countries just starting to think of NDCs and just starting to think of, well, do I really need to think of the Paris Agreement? Now I think that we have reached a lot more consensus on how these things are looking. I think that now we have way more tools to actually help countries think of how to achieve these emissions reductions without sacrificing livelihoods or in many cases productivity gains that I decided. Let me stop there as an opening statement and let my other colleagues just continue the rambling on.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Claudia, if you want to, do you have thoughts? I know you have a recent paper talking a little bit about some of the practice, kind of doing a meta review around some of the practices around driving productivity increases. And so, if you want to kick that off, or if you have other thoughts, go ahead.
So yeah, we had a meta-analysis that actually started with EDF. It took quite a while to come out. So we were able to identify 8 practices there in total, and 5 practices that were effective in reducing emissions. Basically, would just reduce emissions and wouldn't have an impact on animal productivity. So these practices are more for where we actually have a consumer basis who's able to pay for farmers implementing these practices. And then we also identified 3 practices where we saw that there's an increase in production or productivity on the farm. So this is something that often has been applied in the US already, but in the low middle income countries is often lacking. So these are often best management practices. We know these technologies, but the problem that we're having is actually getting them implemented on the ground. When it comes to emissions, in Africa, we actually have very few measurements on what the actual emissions are, and countries have issues going the greenhouse gas reporting for livestock. They're still on the tier 1. If they want to meet their Paris agreements, and there are, I think, 20 countries, no more than that, about 30 that have mitigation on their agenda, actually, of the African countries, but very few from them actually have a tier 2 inventory to account for that. And there's even less data actually looking at if we implement these good management practices, like health practices, which Hayden will talk about more. What are the actual mitigation we're getting? There are many models out there, but they're based on the very limited data that we have for Africa and data from the global north. They're not based on the conditions that we have. So what from our side would be needed is to actually look what are the productivity gains, what are the mitigation gains we get through implementing these practices to then inform or validate the models and get better models in future, and also to help countries do their accounting for livestock greenhouse gas emissions and to see how they can contribute to reduce emissions. The different systems we need to look at. For example, we have the smallholder systems, which Mario was talking about, and there are different issues when you go to the system, and it also depends on region, countries where you go to. Often in Kenya, we're visiting some sites. What we would see is that the cows are generally very skinny. I've never seen a cow that's skinny. Yet they also have already crossbreeds, so the genetics are there to produce more. But the feeding, they really cannot feed the cattle. Some of them don't know how to better produce conserved feed. They're not sufficiently prepared for the dry season, which through climate change often extends now. So then we don't just have the skinny cattle. Now I have a dairy cow that stopped lactating and she's still not pregnant, still standing there on the farm, idle animal, not producing anything. So we need to work on herd structure. Sometimes they can't even detect if that animal is in heat. but they still hold on to them because culturally, cows are important. They're a status symbol. And often the cows are kept because maybe people don't have bank accounts. And they need to, and inflation, the currency stability in countries is very different. They need to pay for school fees, so they will sell a cow. Maybe they use the manure. Some farmers have the cows for manure because they don't have fertilizer. They use the manure to fertilize their crops. So there are different reasons why people have cows. So we also need to understand that and to work with the farmers and see what are they doing, because there are pioneer farmers that have these practices that we know would reduce emission, and see how we can bring these to scale and how they can help us to educate other farmers. So similarly to what we discussed for the US in the previous session. Another example I wanted to talk about was in Uganda, for example, it's a ranging system, so they're bigger herds. There's no rotational grazing. So they don't even know how much grass they can get from their land. They have problems with ticks and tick-borne diseases. If you had rotational grazing implemented, you actually could control that better, which leads to them using acardicides. I've never seen so many blind cows because they've misused these acardicides. So you would see a cow with just a gray eye being blind on multiple farms that we went to. Part of the problem is they don't have access to different types of acardicides because you're supposed to rotate the different, what's it called, the acting compounds, because you have a resistance build up. So they don't have that, and they don't have the education. And just these simple measures, and also explaining, because I don't see it at the neighbors. If you get a farmer who would say, okay, let's try to implement some rotation and see how much grass I can actually get, and they see it, because we had left we'd been pasture sampling on these farms, one exclosure cage. It was like this high. It was full of grass because it's been sitting there so long we had forgotten about it. And the farmer was like, he'd never seen that his pasture could actually get that high. And I've worked in Costa Rica. I've seen intensive rotational systems there. And usually when the cows went back into their pasture, it would be that high at good times. Yeah. So just this understanding and bringing it to the farmers, and having farmers taking ownership and actually educating their communities, because we're working with so many people. There's not enough extension personnel on the ground, and we don't have enough research capacity at this point either to address all these issues. So we do need to work with farmers. We need to have farmers realize what is better for them and how they can improve production, and wanting to help their community to do better.
Great, thanks for that, Claudia. So, and then Hayden, I know you talked a little bit recently. There was recently an FAO report about some of the animal health aspects, and so I don't know if you've been involved with that a little bit, and maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. FAO and GRA.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Maybe just some observations before talking about the specific report. So, like, I've been involved in the negotiations on agriculture throughout a decade or so, and in the research community with my role in the GRA. And what I observed in the kind of late 2000s was due to sort of some reports like the Livestock's Long Shadow that very squarely pointed to livestock, and it had a very ripple effect across a number of different communities. And I think in the kind of livestock community in particular, I noticed within the community of the veterinary community, there's a lot of bad feeling generated from that report, and a very kind of visceral reaction against it. And it occurred to us that if we're ever going to have solutions and livestock really contributing to the mitigation of greenhouse gases, we need these people at the table engaging. We can't have one of the most important communities providing services to livestock keepers and to livestock in general kind of disengaged and angry. So we in the GRA community, we established a number of networks, but one in particular on animal health, because we thought, well, clearly the efforts that are being made by animal health services in general, they are contributing to what Murray has been talking about in terms of increasing the efficiency of production. If you can lower the burden of health or disease on animals, then you enable them to be more productive, all other things being equal. and we felt it very important to create a kind of entry point to mitigation that was not threatening, right? Non-threatening. One that gave multiple benefits in addition to, and in fact, more than importantly than mitigation of greenhouse gases. And with animal health, of course, it contributes to nutritional security if we have more productive animals, but there's also the animal welfare issues. There's the One Health agenda, which is even more prominent today than it was a decade ago. And so we established the network because the other observation was while there had been a lot of work on animal health, there was almost nothing on animal health and greenhouse gases and the kind of connection between or the importance of addressing animal health to reduce greenhouse gases per unit of milk or meat or whichever product. And so we thought, well, if we're going to make the case for this, we also need the science to back it up. And so we established this network to engage the research community to make that connection. And then some years later, to kind of continue to push, I guess, that agenda and demonstrate that there are important contributions that farmers and governments of low and middle income countries can make as part of this mitigation agenda. It is not just feed additives, right? It's something that's really close to their heart and their own development objectives. We produced a report with the Global Dairy Platform, which made the case in kind of economic terms for addressing animal health as a kind of preventative measure, right? If you avoid bad things happening to animals, it makes sense economically. The cost of the treatment, or the prevention rather, is insignificant compared to the costs of the burden of that disease or health condition, whatever it might be. And that was a case study looking at 3 different countries' dairy production using a model, but a reasonably good model at Cranfield. And there was the United Kingdom, Chile, and Kenya. And in all cases, so it's not just a global south issue, in all cases, there was an economic case to improve animal health. And in the UK, so reducing incidence of mastitis was a win-win-win. So it wasn't just a kind of an issue for developing countries either. There were gains to be made in every country. And so the case was demonstrated. And then the question was, well, how do you actually do it? Right? How do you capture the effects of improving animal health within your greenhouse gas inventories, within your MRV systems? Who needs to be involved? What kind of data do you need? And so more recently with FAO, we produced the report, which was basically that. How do you include animal health in climate action? And the reason for that report was based on the observation that in the nationally determined contributions that countries are updating, Claudia mentioned livestock is starting to appear, but when you look at how it appears very much in adaptation, increasingly in mitigation. And when you look at animal health as a potential avenue for mitigation, it appears very little. Animal health is there, but it's more on the adaptation side. And so we thought, well, clearly there's more to be done to actually make the point here that for countries beginning to address mitigation in livestock, one should really look at things like improved animal health and feeding rather than feed additives as your starting point. So we came up with this other report, which was to explain the connections and the impact that different animal health conditions have on productivity and therefore greenhouse gas emissions, as Mario was mentioning, and then kind of some of the preconditions for being able to capture the effects of improving those conditions on greenhouse gases. And one of those is we need greenhouse gas inventories that capture changes in management. We cannot have a greenhouse gas inventory whose methodology is number of animals multiplied by a constant emissions factor every year. And that is the vast majority of countries reporting today still. So we need to get beyond that and get to, what number of animals, which still is important and lacking, but then how heavy are they? How fast are they growing? What are they eating? What's their production, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those factors contribute to the model, which is a greenhouse gas inventory, to better disaggregate and attribute greenhouse gases to different production systems and management practice changes. So the report demonstrated sort of generically how one goes about doing that to make the point about improving tiers of reporting, but also who needs to be involved, right? It's not just the governments or just the research community or just the sector or industry, however you describe it. It's something that actually, I would say needs, but I guess would be better, is probably a more acceptable way to say it, when you have collaboration between government, research and industry, because each one of those actors holds different information and better information sometimes. Industry can hold a lot better information than governments, and it's a question of how to utilize that information in appropriate ways to improve national reporting. The practices farmers currently have to establish baselines, what the change is, and then translating that into greenhouse gases. And so that report was published with that purpose in mind. It doesn't solve the problem for every country in their own circumstances, but it provides general guidance about how one might approach that. And of course, in each country, depending on the way industry is organised, government agencies are organised, the research community is organised, there'll be different, precise ways of implementing that. But as a general guidance, I think it's hopefully it's useful to at least raise the question: why not have that in your consideration for mitigation before thinking of things that are still perhaps out of reach for farmers that are producing kind of 2 or 3 litres of milk a day per cow?
Right. Thank you. Lots of talk, but oh man, we need more time, I think. So I think one of the questions, maybe I'll pose this, that I'm hearing a lot of. So sometimes when we hear productivity, especially if you're in systems, in more intensive systems, you think, okay, everybody makes silage, everybody will use Holstein or Jersey genetics for everyone. But I think maybe the conversation is not so much about maximization, but those are classic activities that we've done here in the U.S., for example, to drive productivity, better genetics, that sort of thing. Maybe that's not the optimal solution, though, in some parts of the world. And so, talk to me maybe a little bit about I wonder about this idea of maybe instead of doing maximization, we think about optimization within communities. And what's that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in low and middle income countries, the systems have multiple objectives, and that's a big difference. Here they also have multiple objectives, but the economic objective is very, very. It's the biggest one. It's dollars per hectare, and really making a living, and profits have been decreasing and so on. So, the narrative for intensifying, for becoming super efficient and cost reducing is essential here. But you go to anywhere in low and middle income countries, and it's as Claudia was saying, all of a sudden you have to pay school fees. All of a sudden you don't have, you need to prioritize your labor for tending at your food crops. You're going to have lots of people now having a source of farm income as part of the farm, so they'll have to go somewhere else. There's a whole education transition now with the kids having way more access that you will not have. You'll have difficulty in having farmers in the future in many of these places. But it's a system more linked to risk reduction than to having to maximize productivity and so on. It's managing many balls at the same time. That will remain. That will remain for as long as the typical intensification theory of changing practices and changing your kind of system as a response to the opportunity cost of labor and land. Unless that changes, they will continue being multi-objective systems with focusing on the risk side. Why is dairy so cool, and why are chickens so important in those systems? Because it's sometimes not even about income; it's about cash flow. And it's cash flow. It's having a little bit of money every single day. That's why dairy has been super popular. And that little bit of money allows them to transact in the market and go and buy the veggies and other things that will allow them. It's the daily basis. Chickens are really good for that. And then, the goats and sheep, preferably for the big expenses of having to, that model, a lot of people, when I was at ILRI especially, oh, you're so romantic, everybody's going to disappear. Well, there's millions and millions still there, and there will still be millions to 2050 with these multiple objectives.
I would like to add something to what Mario is saying. Right now, how we look at emission intensity, this is really formulated. This is made for global north systems. this is where you have a single objective. It doesn't take into account all the multi-purposes of these animals on these farms. And also the adaptation is not just the adaptation that we're looking at on animal basis to make the animal more resilient to whatever comes with climate change, but also the farm. So I have my anecdote. So my Uber driver, he had cows. He tells me, yeah, cows. I ask them how much they produce. I don't know if they really produce 20 kilos. It's quite a bit, because I tell them if they do 6-8 kilograms of milk, this is good, because that's what the Gerber paper actually said, where if you have that production, there's not really any increase in emission, reduction in emission intensity. So it's actually, when I give talks, I'm like, look, I'm not asking you to go up to 20, 40 kilos. If you get to 8, that's all you need to get to, because it's reachable for these people. Anyways, that taxi driver had cows at home, was making 20 kilos, he said. And I asked him, so do you think they could give more? He said, yes, but that would me require to be at the farm. Now I'm out here driving this Uber. I'm making money doing this. I would need to put more time into this. So now for him, it didn't make sense. But then at the same time, you could say, okay, he is more resilient, because if there's a drought now, he may be able to buy some extra feed for the cattle. It depends on what he does with that extra resilience too. And we don't know, because a lot of times I think that the social science and bringing social scientists in to look at these issues and look at the dynamics on the farms we haven't done that. I've worked in the global north. We looked at how do we measure, how do we mitigate, but bringing actually social scientists along the way to see how do we get adoption forward has not happened. So now, while in Africa, I feel like we need to look, okay, what are the mitigations for the different strategies? We know what kind of strategies we should be looking for and which may be most impactful. Let's get the numbers for this, but at the same time, work on the ground, work with the farmers, see what they're doing, so we can get implementation on the ground and we actually get farmers believing into making these changes.
Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that optimization is a much better approach. I was just thinking about the curve, the Gerber curve, which sort of plots the milk intensity by yield. And if you look at that, you note that when you get to about 3,500 to 4,000 kilos per cow per year, you basically have no gain in efficiency in terms of a greenhouse gas unit output, up to sort of 12,000 litres per cow. So it suggests to me like maximizing doesn't really gain much from an emissions perspective. Because as you start to intensify further and further and increasing yield, you're increasing emissions of other sources like manure and energy and everything else. So, optimization in every system type seems to be a better approach. And it also, I think, probably brings more of the other factors that you need to consider, other environmental considerations too, like water quality and eutrophication, animal welfare, and everything else, which sometimes can be overlooked in this pursuit of greenhouse gas efficiency. In addition to the various other cultural factors that Claudia was just talking about and the other services that livestock provide, I think other environmental impacts can also be maybe more adequately considered in an optimization goal rather than a maximization goal.
Great. Thank you for all of that. Maybe open it up to I have some more questions, but maybe open it up to the audience in case there are any questions. Yep.
Consistent with this optimization question we've been discussing, didn't hear anyone talk a lot about quality. So yield is just amount, but what about the nutrient quality of the resulting product? The role of genetic diversity as well, which suffers generally and on scale yield as we know on the rest of the world that we've really driven nutrient quality and genetic diversity way down. Probably by a factor of 100 or so. But what are the gains if you get a nutrient diversity?
So maybe I'll just repeat the question for folks online. So if I understood the question, it's about sometimes with productivity, we also need to think about not just maximizing total milk production, for example, but also what's the quality of the milk production. So, and that's from a nutrient value, so fat and protein, for example, or other nutrients. And then also, how do we account for genetic diversity and the need to maintain genetic diversity within our herds? Is that?
Yeah, and other species in a multi-purpose farm.
Yep.
Yeah, which includes soil quality, of course, with animals that regenerate the soil.
Yeah, the panelists.
Well, I mean, on the nutrient quality, what to say? I mean, my understanding is in many cases nutrient quality's gone up because animals have been selected for higher milk solid content. But it would depend on the incentives farmers are facing as well, right? I mean, if you're getting paid per litre, that's one incentive. If you're getting paid per milk solid or fat or whatever, that would be a different incentive and different response. And the breeding indices that would then presumably be optimized for whatever signal the farmer's getting would change. So, I mean, I get, yeah, if you're getting incentivized to produce more milk litres, I could see how you may compromise nutritional content of the milk, but if the signal's right, it might be right at least. I come from New Zealand. If it's about milk solids, then you're going to be breeding for higher milk solid content. I haven't seen many examples of like a decreasing nutritional content of milk, but maybe I just haven't read widely enough.
I wonder too, from a nutrition perspective. So farmers, I think one of the things we've talked about a lot is farmer adaptation, right? Or adoption, right? Farmers are going to be key to adopting all of these practices. But that's millions of farmers. How do we build communications that are nuanced enough to say, what's the local situation look like and what does optimization look like? So how do we kind of, well, you talked about social science before. I mean, that's a pretty large undertaking if we think about global production systems.
Yeah.
Well, I still think for at least the African context, if you get people take ownership for their regions and if they believe into something, they will teach their community. But you need to reach the right people. And I think when you do the selection and you train people, you already need to say like, well, we expect you to train your peers and empower them to do so, because sometimes they're not feeling secure enough to do that. That I think also needs to be enforced, because sometimes I feel like they sort of feel like they're the receivers who need to be trained, but empower them to actually feel like, hey, I know this now, I can teach my community, because you still have a big community, sense of community. So I think you can leverage that. But again, it's not science. This is I've worked with a colleague or friend, and it's basically, I saw her teaching people how to compost. It turned into a religion. Like we had the event and everybody was there, and the farmers who actually went then and actually educate their community. Now they built their own group, and they do this because they believe in what they've seen, what it did to their land, because they usually don't have fertilizer. Now they're putting compost, using the animal manure and whatever household scrap there is. And they saw an improvement in their yields and their corn yields and whatsoever. And now they're like sort of full believers, and they go and educate their community because they think it's important for their community to know and to improve their country, because they want their country to do better and their community to do better. And only if we have, in my opinion, only if we have that kind of reach, we can actually lead to transformation on the ground. Because again, we don't have enough extension workers, we don't have enough scientists. It needs to be, when we're looking at smallholders, it needs to be the people educating each other.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. There's been a lot of instruments related to collective action that have been quite successful, and you cannot count on the government support. When you go to Kenya, you have enormous districts with one extension officer. So, you can't really just count. In many cases, the private industry has been very helpful, but also, there's been instruments like farmer field schools, farmer to farmer field days. It's demo farms that other farmers have access to, that you go and they teach from They learn from what they see and things like that, and that has been super successful in many parts of Latin America. That's been just a really useful model, and in sub-Saharan Africa, yes, especially with the oral traditions and the very close-knit communities in many places. Yeah, it has to start by the farms.
Questions here in the back, maybe?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm a reporter with New Scientist magazine. You mentioned at the beginning that enteric methane emissions are the largest single source of methane emissions. Can you break that down by the contribution of large-scale industrial livestock production versus the small-scale livestock production you discussed? I'm also curious, I understand that increasing production can decrease the emission intensity, but can increasing production decrease the overall amount of methane produced by livestock? You mentioned the rebound effect.
Yeah, okay. So look, from the global statistics that we've computed in the past, we know that mixed systems are the main source of methane emissions globally, and that's simply because that's where the majority of the animals are. Low and middle income countries will produce more methane, but again, it's largely driven by animal numbers. That's a fact. Probably the beef sector will have lower, super high emissions intensities relative to the dairy sector, although with enormous variability depending on where you are. In terms of, it's almost a prerequisite that you need to maintain or reduce animal numbers while increasing production if you want to have a net mitigation effect. You could, in specific circumstances, achieve a little bit of mitigation, but not the gains that you would get if you really reduced or maintained the animal numbers. Actually.
Yeah, it depends very much your starting point, whether you reduce emissions in absolute terms or not. Yeah. If you have animals, emissions are driven by numbers of animals, but really it's about intake, right, of what they eat. So if animals aren't eating much, and then you feed them better and eat more, then they will emit more methane. That's a given. Per animal. Now, livestock as a sector, it's like what Mario said, depends. Depends on structural changes, animal numbers, whether you remove empty cows or whatever approach you might take to change the herd structure. But it's almost inevitable that increasing intake increases emissions per animal while increasing production significantly, right? That's the intensity question. It's tricky, yeah.
And I think you also need to show the different challenge. So if you look at Europe, human population is not expected to grow really much up to 250. If you look at Africa, it's going to triple. So now we have a low consumption. Comparatively, Africa eats less than a third of the red meat and milk protein what Europe eats per capita. And this will increase likely. The projections are by 30% up to 250, but it will still be a third of what Europe is going to consume. But the emissions are projected to go so much more up if they produce their own livestock or animal products, just because the population is going up. So they will struggle to reduce emissions because we're in a very different situation. We have no overproduction compared to demand. We have an underproduction. Meanwhile, we look at the US and Europe, we actually have an oversupply and overproduction per capita. We're exporting. So it's much simpler, I would say, in some regards for Europe and the US to make some reductions because we're not expecting animal herds to go further up because we already maxed it, basically. Meanwhile, in Africa, we still have some land and we have growth and we do need. So in cities within Kenya, I do think that depending on the wealth of the population, they eat too much meat too. But if you go really into rural areas, this is a high nutritive source of protein and nutrients. And these animals there, they may have high emission intensities because they're not producing that much, but for the livelihood and for the nutrition of the owners of these cattle, these or goats or sheep, these animals are very vital. And this will probably remain like this unless we actually help the farmers to produce more. But often you also can't forget they're living already on marginal lands. There is not much more you can do with that land.
I have a worry and a question. My worry is about high efficiency exporting countries, such as the US and Europe. What happens when they export less? Like Europe is really moving towards reduction of the number of animals. Assume, for instance, the milk is exported to North of Africa right now, Egypt, Morocco. What happens if they no longer do that? How can we? So I'm worried about leakage, right? That's what I'm trying to say here. Like you then replace it with milk produced somewhere else at a higher footprint per gallon. And if you had a magic wand and you could really sort of make sure that farmers learn from each other and you have all these social issues that Claudia alluded to, you fix all of those. What is the one thing you would want farmers to learn? What do you think is the one, is it the animal health? Is it better feed? If so, what aspect of the feed? Like, what's the first thing that you would pick up? And I guess it's a question for all of you. Pick up one thing. What would it be?
Yeah, having enough feed and enough quality feed. Like first having enough, and second work on the quality.
Yeah, it's without a doubt that's the biggest one. That's the biggest constraint. Yeah. And
well-fed animals are fertile animals generally. Right?
Yeah. And and your leakage question is important because increasingly relocation of production features heavily in some of as a strategy to get to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's this assumption that we'll have to increase producing the places where you can actually do it as efficiently as possible. Export, well, that's, as you say, the reality is pointing towards a completely different thing, simply because markets are changing, prices are, it's not as effective or as it used to be, or profitable as it used to be before. And you also want to, to promote livelihoods opportunities locally, which is the business of many donors, that are now in New York talking about what to try to do.
But then the export of milk from Europe to Africa, that doesn't really reach the people who need the nutrition, right? Yeah. That is another thing, I think. And one thing I think we should, again, it's not just emissions, it's also nutrient cycles we need to look at. Because right now, for example, in the US, where does California get all their feed from? I think it's somewhere from Texas. So there's all these nutrients shipped into California. So we have a nutrient import there. We have nitrogen leakage, we have nitrogen pollution. It doesn't get back to where it came from. The same with China, gets a lot of their feed from Brazil. Brought to China, I think China, if they don't make it more of a circular economy, you have got these nutrient imports into hotspots, which is going to be a huge problem for the public health and so on in future if we don't think about this as well. So anytime, from my perspective, we look at greenhouse gas emissions, we also need to look at nutrient cycling.
Yeah, and the other thing, we must not forget that, the imports are important, but relatively to local production, there's still a small amount. They're 15%, 16, max 20. They do play a part for the urban populations, but it's animal products are used mostly in country.
Joe. Yep.
Yeah, hi. We were talking about sort of the social structure. I'm just wondering,
what role you see co-ops playing or other type of social structures that might improve education and so forth and profitability for farmers.
It's been enormous. You look at the Latin America as an example with the co-ops. They've driven smallholder production of not only of livestock products, horticulture, a very broad range of highly nutritious foods. It's those kinds of collective action mechanisms that will actually help a lot. And you see it also in Southeast Asia. In Vietnam, you get groupings. They're not called co-ops, but their social structures have been way more organized to trade vegetables and other products as well. And in Africa, it hasn't worked for cultural reasons, but any other method of collective action is really where we need to try to be. It's proven. Yeah. In India, you have incredible examples. Cooperatives, women's cooperatives for selling milk with thousands and thousands of associates. And
just put a plug in before that earlier today, as part of our food day, we had an interview with the chairman of the NDDB, the National Dairy Development Board of India. So come back to the website. We recorded that, and we'll come back to that, and you can see more about the work in India and the cooperatives and what they're thinking there. So one more question.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the point you're making about just improving basic animal health, nutrition, and feeding, feed ingredients, quality feed ingredients, and feeding strategies. I'm curious, separate from feed additive technologies, do you know of innovations, or what do you think of innovations that are trying to leapfrog improving animal nutrition strategies? So things like precision feeding or almost like vitamin supplements, if you will. I know there's folks looking at enzymes or things like that at specific points of the life cycle of an animal. But things that, it's not trivial to think of how to diversify and get good feed ingredients and something after the whole feed market and bootstrapping. Solving that problem isn't necessarily overnight simple. But I'm just thinking of other ways you could leapfrog. Yes, you got to work on feed ingredients, but maybe there's other things too that are out there that might leapfrog.
So I don't think that eating a lot of concentrate is necessarily the solution. So what we are actually wanting is to teach, especially farm holders, how to make better use of their land, how to grow certain legumes, for example, get more protein in their diets, at what stage to cut their grass, how to do better management of their pastures, how to do better management of their fodder crops. Because often this cash flow problem, what we've been talking about, they don't have the money. So you see that when they do, some of them in Kenya, they have access to artificial insemination, and they sometimes have access to sex semen because the county government, it's actually subsidized by the county government. But then when the day comes and the cow is serviced, in the end, it depends on how much money they have, what they decide to do. There's no planning there with many of the farmers because they're just unexpected events that will make you not having that cash flow. So it's more about teaching how to make better use of what they have rather than putting additional burden on farmers of buying extra things to feed their cattle.
Yeah, I think it's not asking anything that hasn't been done somewhere already, in a way. It's like it's a lack of information at the right place at the right time. There's some cultural, structural issues around, say, range lands and grazing lands, where in some countries you see quite intensive management by the farmer of the parcels of land, rotational grazing, whatever you want to call it. In others, you don't. And maybe because the incentives aren't there or the farmers has a different way of engaging with their farm. They own the farm, but they're not the farmer. So finding ways to provide better information on the available feed resource to manage it better in time and space. When it comes to kind of residues or crop residues or other residues that may be incorporated into animals' diets, understanding what the nutritional value of that material is, so that animals' diets can be optimized for nutritional requirements by species. All of that. I mean, tools have been developed. I mean, you've been involved. Right? Cornell's been involved in the US dairy industry and in many industries around the world. Providing kind of consensus guidance for farmers to then have the right ration formulation, but in other parts of the world it's non-existent. Let alone to think about what the emissions are associated with that diet. So better information would be a very good start, because it's not a technological breakthrough we need. It's like applying knowledge in situ that we need. So it's an extension, an education question.
I think anything else final on that one, or I'll just say I think one leapfrog I might look at is technology, and from a communications technology. So how do we get that knowledge out? And there might be some leapfrogs there. I think we are at time. We could keep going for a while, but thank you very much for our panelists. If we give them a round of applause.